Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
There you go. And welcome to the Albany State University Dr. Martin Luther King Junior Convocation program. I am pleased to see so many beautiful faces in the crowd this morning. At this time, I want to ask everyone to silence their cell phones and electronic devices. Go ahead and give you a minute. Good. Hi, I'm OBO Jones, Mr. Royal Gentleman 2014-2015, and I will be the presiding officer this morning. The program will proceed as follows. We'll have the anointed ASU Gospel Choir with a selection for Dr. King, followed by the introduction of the speaker by Miss Albany State University, Taylor Martin.
Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Coming forth to carry me home. Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Coming forth to carry me home.
Tell all my friends I'm coming too.
Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. Coming forth to carry me home. Hush, hush. Somebody's calling my name.
Everybody say,
Hush,
oh,
hush.
yeah, yeah.
Somebody's calling my name.
Everybody say,
Hush,
oh, Lord,
hush.
yeah, yeah.
Somebody's calling my name.
Oh, my Lord,
oh, my Lord,
oh, Lord.
oh, my Lord. What shall I do? What shall I do? It sounds like Jesus. Somebody's calling my name. It sounds like Jesus. Somebody's calling my name. The trumpet sounds within on my soul. Ain't got long. 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 Ain't got long to stay.
Good morning. I am Taylor Martin, Miss Albany State University 2014-2015, and I am pleased to introduce the speaker. Miss Cheryl Brown Henderson is one of the 3 daughters of the late Reverend Oliver L. Brown, who along with 12 other parents, led by the NAACP, filed a lawsuit against the local Board of Education on behalf of their children. This historic case is called the Oliver L. Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954. Ms. Brown Henderson is the founding president of the Brown Associates for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research, and the owner of the Brown Associates Educational Consulting Firm. Her experience include public advocacy, public policy implementation, federal legislative development. Her foundation has provided scholarship to more than 100 minority students, established libraries for children in low-income communities, developed curriculum on the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka case. Invited to the White House on 6 occasions, Ms. Brown Henderson has been a 6th grade teacher, university guest lecturer, school guidance counselor, and a state educational administrator. Ms. Cheryl Brown Henderson is the past chair of Women's Work, has lectured at more than 300 college campuses, and for various national organizations and community groups. She received numerous awards in recognition of the Brown decision and has appeared in televised newspaper interviews nationwide about this historic case. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to distinguished and esteemed speaker of the hour, Ms. Cheryl Brown Henderson.
With some footage from Henry Hampton's Black Side. If you may remember that Henry Hampton was the visionary that came up with the idea of capturing the civil rights movement in film. And before he passed away, he did a remix for me that I like to use, especially when it's a program commemorating the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King. So before I begin my formal remarks, please join me in viewing some of the footage from Henry's Black Side production.
I guess our courage came out of because we didn't have nothing, that we couldn't lose nothing. But we wanted something for ourselves and for our children. And so we took a chance with our lives.
We marched up the steps with this circle of soldiers with bayonets drawn. And walking up the steps that day was probably one of the biggest feelings I've ever had.
My freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
Are you scared?
Yes, I'm very much afraid. Everyone here is.
In a 10-year period, in the 1950s and 1960s, America fought a second revolution. It was fought in the South by black people and white. It was fought in the streets, in churches, in courts, in schools. It was fought to make America be America for all its citizens. These were America's civil rights years.
I take it then that you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national chain stores?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of chain stores.
People of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street.
It was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that, you continue to answer it.
I had never seen a new book until Mrs. Flowers brought books from the white school for me to read. The slick pages, I couldn't believe it. And that's when I think my first anger, real anger, at a depressive and oppressive system began.
Then, in the early 1950s, after years of carefully planned litigation, the NAACP brought these demands to the Supreme Court. The test cases were set in school. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. It called into question the whole system of segregation. The South resisted desegregation with legal and illegal delays. It would take years before the Supreme Court's decision would be implemented in any meaningful way, but it had one immediate effect.
I think that the greatest impact of the Brown decision was on the black community itself. It was a statement to the black community that they had a friend, so to speak, the Supreme Court. And so it emboldened the communities of blacks around the country to move forward, to secure their own rights.
Let me give you this statement, which I think will come
Get the mic down.
as an expression of deep joy to all of us. Judge Johnson has just ruled that we have a legal and constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery.
The judge's action cleared the way for the march, but Governor Wallace still refused to provide the necessary protection. So President Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard.
We're marching on to freedom land.
54 miles and 5 days marching. They were now 25,000 strong.
As we travel the narrow way, we're going.
To me, there was never a march like this one before. There haven't been one since. It was a sense of community moving there. And as you walk, you saw people coming, waving, bringing you food or bringing you something to drink. You saw the power of the most powerful country on the face of the earth.
In the euphoria of the moment, no one could know the traditional civil rights movement would never again be the same. The fragile coalition that had shaped the movement for so long was coming to an end.
It was a great moment to go back to Montgomery because, you see, for us, it was returning to Montgomery after 10 years. And I kept thinking about 10 years earlier, how we were visibly just blacks. And when you looked at that march, you had Catholic priests and nuns, and you had other clergy, and you had a lot of white people. It was really a beautiful thing to pass Dexter Avenue and go toward the Capitol, marching together and listening to Martin's speech.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. And that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath were stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
I think in light of everything that's gone on this past year, it's important for us to refocus on how we got here. African Americans have been this nation's greatest teachers. We have been the moral voice and conscience of this nation. Before I begin, though, I want to thank Mr. Jones for the greetings. I want to thank Deborah Williams, Mrs. Williams, for the invitation to be here. And I want to thank Miss Martin, who is the Miss Albany State, for the introduction today. And I want to thank all of you for being here this morning. So I bring you greetings from Kansas, a place that I'm sure many of you have never been. How many of you have been to Kansas? All right. Did you stop? Because we recognize that it's not a place that people often think of when they think about diversity, when they think about black folks, when they think about civil rights, yet Kansas has been uniquely positioned and very critical to the civil rights history of our country. Last year, 2014, was the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. It was the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it was the 20th anniversary of the South African Constitution. However, what was most striking to me about this last year of 2014 was that we ended the year with the mantra of Black Lives Matter, which to me sounded eerily like 1964. Now here we are in a new year, and Happy New Year, we hope. But 2015 brings us another host of anniversaries. 2015 brings us the 50th of the March from Selma to Montgomery, the 50th of the Voting Rights Act, and the 60th of the murder of Emmett Till. We roll into another year being reminded of how our nation has behaved toward us as people of color. You know, I think about when we grew up as young people, and I see people that are in my peer group out there. I won't call you out, because some of you may be dyeing that hair, so we won't know that you're 60-something. But I'm going to say that for us growing up, you know, we started our school day with the Pledge of Allegiance. But as we got older, we recognized that although we pledged our allegiance to this nation, the nation was showing little allegiance to its people of color, which called upon us to make a choice. Everything we do, every action we take is a choice we make. Now, whether that's going to be a demand for something better, bolstered by an intellectual argument with the influence and power that it takes to make change. You know, swagger and attitude won't get you anywhere. So one of the things that we keep pounding into the heads of your generation is that what Black folks have done uniquely and need to continue to do is we have been smart about the changes we knew needed to be made. We have made certain we had a seat at the table. Now, I was so pleased to see young people out in the streets this summer demanding that law enforcement stop the brutality, demanding that this whole system of grand juries be thrown out and let the chips fall where they may. You know, I went to a rally this summer after, young Michael Brown was murdered. And one of the things that struck me about the images coming out of Ferguson, Missouri, is that none of this was necessary. Even after he was murdered, if we had been shown the proper respect, there would have been no demonstration. There would have been no looting. There wouldn't have been all of this aftermath that we're talking about. If 3 or 4 things had happened to recognize the humanity of that young man. Number one, the minute he was murdered, that police officer should have been taken into custody. That's number one. Number two, his body should have been picked up by a coroner, not laying in the street like roadkill for 4 hours. Number three, the police department should have come out publicly with the press conference apologizing to the community for the mistake that had been made and ensuring them that every effort to find out what happened would be undertaken on their part. And fourth, in the VFW hall, the high school, someplace, they should have set up crisis counselors. We are in shock. We are frustrated, we are fearful, we are angry when those things happen, but nobody seems to take the time to try to heal our wounds. Yet anytime there is a shooting in a public school, what happens first of all? Van loads of counselors come in to talk to the students and the parents about what happened. You know, as long as this country continues to deny the humanity in our community, we will continue to protest. We will continue to beat the drum. We will continue to be angry and frustrated. Now, I won't belabor this because I'm not here to talk about it, but we must recognize what's happened. We must recognize that history is moonwalking backward. And we have to insist that it stop right here and now. Now, the one video I could not watch this last summer was the beating of the woman along the freeway in California. That one was just too close to home. Unarmed, yet again, gloved male fist, beating her for no reason we have yet to be privy to. The chokehold on Mr. Garner. So I say it again, swagger and attitude really won't take you very far unless you want to be that next victim. We must be smart about how we conduct ourselves and how we encounter those who have the authority to do what we've seen take place over the summer. Brown v. Board of Education is what I'm here to talk about. And Dr. Martin Luther King in 1957, in his first March on Washington, rallied people to Washington to talk about and to make demands that this country implement the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education. So Dr. King was also influenced by this change in Brown v. Board. You see, our country, and what Brown, I believe, attempted to do, was to bridge the gap between democratic theory and historic practice. We talk a good game. But when it comes to privilege for some and disadvantage for others, that seems to be what we're best at. So Brown v. Board was all about bridging the gap between historic practice and democratic theory. You see, Brown is considered one of the most unique judicial decisions in this country's history. And I brought a PowerPoint only as a backdrop because I don't want to leave here without educating. Anytime you take the podium, and I know I've got a fellow AME in the room, where is he? All right. And he's already warned you that when an AME gets a microphone, look out. Now, my father was a pastor, an AME minister, and one thing I learned as a child watching him, first of all, I learned the power of words, but secondly, I also learned that on those Sundays when the sanctuary looked like this room, it may not have been his best sermon, but it was his longest. I guess he figured I got a church full of folks, I'm gonna work on them for a while. So I did learn, and I do respect that. But Brown is supposedly one of the most significant decisions in this country. Secondly, Brown laid the foundation for civil rights and human rights struggles around the world. And it ushered in all sorts of reform, African American and white children going to school together. But what it really, at the heart of it, was trying to find a legal way to address the tendencies that we have as human beings. Now, I'm going to let everybody off the hook. right off the bat. Because the tendency to prejudge and discriminate against and to ostracize people based on various characteristics, it's a human trait. I don't like everybody. It's okay, you know? And I'm sure there are plenty of people that probably are not really fond of me either. And that's okay. We have a right to be who we are. But when you act on it is when problems begin. Back in the 70s, when my son was born, one Saturday morning, woman knocking on my door, waking us up. I was disturbed because I didn't want the baby, awakened. I opened the door and there was a white woman on my porch with her daughter, and they were holding a bucket of water and they had a sponge. Now, my husband and I had moved into that neighborhood about 4 months earlier, and we were the second black family in this particular community in our city. And I said, well, what can I help you with? And she wanted to know if she could have some more water. She was trying to wash my sidewalk. I said, wash my sidewalk for what? So I stepped outside and looked, and somebody had written the N-word in red paint on our sidewalk. Welcome to the community. But I said, no. First of all, no, I'm not going to give you any water because I don't want it washed off. I didn't put it there. And if this is what people want their community to look like, if they wanted to face my property as their neighbors, so be it. We didn't use the front door anyway. We came in through the garage. But I wanted to make it clear to her, race is always a problem that somebody wants us to take responsibility for. I like me. I'm looking out at this audience and you are beautiful. Why should that be a problem? One of my fellow teachers said when we were going through what they called sensitivity training, wanted to know back in the day, why did we want to be called black? Because after all, black was such a negative thing, But I said, wait a minute, what about black limousines and, black tie affairs? And black has a very positive connotation if you wanted to. Oh, but she wouldn't be outdone. So she came back to me and said, well, I bet when you see a black cat crossing the street, you cross too like everybody else. And I said, oh no, it depends on how good looking he is. So the truth of that little story is that it is not our problem. Don't make it so. If somebody tries to suggest that you're lesser than because of your complexion, flip the script on them. It's something that we, in fact, should be proud of. So Brown v. Board of Education ushered in a lot of social change. But before I talk to anybody about Brown and its importance, the one thing you have to recognize is nothing in this country with respect to discrimination, denial of opportunity, bigotry, and everything else, none of those things have happened by accident. What you see on the screen is a section of the United States Constitution. It was all very intentional. If you look at the constitutional article that I've referenced, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, that excluded Native Americans completely and made the rest of us only 3/5 of a person. So anytime somebody says to me, black folks are just a little bit too sensitive about these issues, I tell them to just talk to the hand. Because if you wrote it down, if you ratified it, you meant it. So I don't want any of the young people in this room walking around thinking that, this is just something. No, it was part of the fabric of this nation. Now, we the people never meant we the people of color. It never meant we the women. It never meant we the aged. It never meant we the LBGT community. It only meant we the guys that are sitting here at the table writing this stuff. That's about it. So we have had no chance from day one. Slavery was codified by the Constitution and didn't really end until those amendments after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So this stuff is entrenched, let me assure you. So power has and will never concede anything. That's why every generation has to step up to the plate. We thought, those of us with the raised fifths and the big hair, we thought we were going to make the difference. This is it. We're going to change. Civil rights movement on our back. After us, we thought we were the be-all, end-all. Wrong. Because Brown v. Board of Education on May 17, 1954, our parents felt the same way. That's why we have to know our history. Because had they only thought for a moment, Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter and Jack Greenberg and my parents and all of those people who were part of Brown v. Board, if they'd only thought for a minute and remembered our history and remembered the era of Reconstruction, it didn't last very long. Because the white community in this country has been bound and determined to stay on top. You know, you look at the Constitution, that tells you right there. We were not even considered full people, written in the laws of this country. Then when Dred Scott took to court, and sued for his freedom in 1857, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision saying that African Americans had no rights, that white folks were obligated to respect. Strike two. 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, another opportunity for the United States Supreme Court to make that sea change. What did they do? Let's just keep these folks separate. But separate was never intended to be equal. Don't fool yourself by any stretch of the imagination. So all of these things were very much part of the fabric of this nation. They were all very intentional. It took a Brown v. Board of Education to make that change. See, Dr. King, when he got to Montgomery, Alabama, by way of Pennsylvania and Boston, he understood something quite plainly, that theologians could not just be about saving souls. What good is saving somebody's soul if they're going to hate their neighbor? What good is saving somebody's soul if they're going to just have disdain for everybody that doesn't look like them? Our churches became the crucible. It became the place that we cultivated our leadership skills. It was a place, it was a safe harbor, but it was also a place of activism and recognizing that the leadership of our churches had to step out of the pulpit into the streets to make the kind of change, the kind of difference that we needed to be made. So Brown v. Board of Education, changed many things. It overturned other civil rights, overturned other restrictive legislation and court decisions. But most importantly, number 4, see, as United States citizens, we have certain sovereign power that we don't seem to recognize. I watch what happens in the streets. We have this little thing called the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that Brown v. Board, for the first time in the history of this nation, forced the United States Supreme Court to interpret, to say that African Americans were in fact citizens and thereby had equal protection under the law, and that our rights were not to be restricted, at least through any legal means. And then 5th, Brown was important because you know what? A lie does not stay hidden long. So during this era of the 50s, early 1950s, the Soviet Union and other countries around the world that were communist-leaning began to look at the United States and say, who do you think you are? You're telling the rest of the world how to treat, you're talking about human rights abuses, and look what you're doing with African American citizens right there at home. So when the next president rolled in, from Kansas, by the way, Dwight Eisenhower, the first thing he did was to go on the Voice of America to announce to the world that Brown v. Board had in fact been ruled on unanimously, and that this country was living up to its constitutional promise with respect to black folks. This last thing, and then I'm going to go back to a straight lecture, but I have to show you this. This is how the country looked with respect to segregation. You'll see the areas where blue, where segregation was prohibited. You see where there was no particular legislation, but you see all across the South where segregation was required. Now, the reason I wanted you to see this is because a very important concept comes out of this. This is the 2008 election. Let me go backwards. So take a good look at where segregation was required, and then take a look at the 2008 election. What I think this tells us, first of all, we'll just cut off Florida because it's very Latin. 70% of people in Miami, for example, are Hispanic. So Florida has shifted but you look at the rest of the South who voted against Obama, all the red states. But the other thing this tells us is that the North may have won the physical war, but the war of ideology made its way out of the South into Montana and the Dakotas and Kansas and all of those places where every now and then you'll hear radical groups talking about creating a white homeland. People seem to forget that what this country is multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-abilitied, multilingual. That's never going to change. And as hard as they try, and believe me, our government has been behind some of the most strident attempts, bringing in Chinese to help build the railroads, and then passing legislation that would limit their ability to stay. Using Hispanics to build railroads across the South and then loading them up on railroad cars to take them back to Mexico. Now, our hands are so far from clean. But what's important about that message from you is that political activism, social activism, all of that is still very necessary. But Brown v. Board. You see, Brown, as I think about it, in three ways: myths, challenges, and unanticipated consequences. Number one, the myths of Brown. Most people believe the Brown v. Board was something that came about in isolation. But Brown versus the Board of Education was 105 years in the making. How many of you knew that? Anybody in the room? Somebody knew. First time black folks took to court this idea of segregated public schools was in 1849 in Boston, Roberts versus the city of Boston. Because you see, we knew that to be a person of consequence in this country, you needed to be an educated person. Why do you think education is still something we fight over each and every day? Why do you think people like Jonathan Kozol have written books about, savage inequalities? Why do you think that schools that are predominated by students of color are stigmatized, referred to as failing, underfunded institutions? Give me a break. It shouldn't matter the complexion of the student. The job is the same. The purpose is the same. And I've never understood anyway why my complexion seems to adversely affect some white student's ability to get an education. What is that about? I'll walk in the room and all of a sudden you can't learn, so I need to be out of here. It makes no sense to me. But none of this makes sense. It's all about power and privilege for some and disadvantage for others, which happens in this instance to be us. But Robert Morris, an African-American attorney, was the lead attorney in 1849. And his co-counsel, Charles Sumner, who was a white attorney who went on to be a U.S. senator. You see, the myth of Brown is just that it's something that just happened, popped up in 1950 to 54. But African Americans had been on this journey for a century, more than a century, of recognizing that education was going to make the difference for us in this country. See, my home state of Kansas, as you'll see on the screen, and as much as, people don't want to think that it's a very diverse place, after the Civil War, Kansas actually recruited black folks to come live in Kansas. Promised land, promised opportunity. But the more of us that took them up on that offer, like seems to always be the case, when you get that critical mass, then all of a sudden the white citizens of Kansas thought, wait a minute, this is working too well. We need to start segregating some of this stuff. People are taking advantage of this opportunity in ways that we had not anticipated. So very early on in my state of Kansas, African-American parents started suing to integrate public schools as early as 1881, even before there was an NAACP. Black folks in Kansas were taking these issues to court. And I think largely because we were sold a bill of goods. And once we got there, and it wasn't like they promised, we were emboldened to take steps, to go to court, to take action. Very proud of my state for this reason, because like no other state in the country, Kansas was the most active around the issue of school desegregation. 11 cases before Brown, 3 other cases in Topeka before Brown. So Brown v. Board was not unique, it wasn't happenstance, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for the state of Kansas. The myth, and I want to get to the challenges and unanticipated consequences, is that somehow Kansas is a place where it's not progressive. You look at what's going on there now, and I will agree it has changed greatly. But all of those cases took place because the Kansas law indicated that you could have segregated schools, but only at the elementary level. So that meant if you were a large city and you had a critical mass of black folks, you could have segregated schools, but only elementary schools and no place else. So my mother went to an integrated high school for academics. Segregated basketball teams, segregated football teams, segregated cheerleading squads. So the school district was so committed to this crazy system that all day long you sat in class with all sorts of students. But at the end of the day, 2 football teams, 2 basketball teams, 2 cheerleading squads, 2 proms. So it makes no sense, as I keep saying to you early on. But what I want to show you is, first of all, Brown v. Board was a combination of 5 cases from Delaware, Kansas, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court decision, in my view, the most important thing, it talked about the responsibility of state and local governments to educate our children. The legal team was immense. We hear about Thurgood Marshall, but there were dozens of attorneys and local community organizers who were behind Brown v. Board. Charles Houston, who was considered the father of who killed Jim Crow. The Delaware case, the people involved there. The Bowling case in Washington, D.C. The Briggs case in South Carolina. The Brown case, which is the problem child. We are the problem child because in most of your textbooks it will tell you that Brown was all about Oliver Brown, my father here, who sued the school board because his child wanted to go to the neighborhood school that was white and she could not. He was angered by that and took this to court, and that happens not to be true. So much of our history is written by somebody else. It's up to us to tell our story. Brown v. Board very quickly happened because McKinley Burnett, who was chair of the NAACP, decided to sue the school board one more time. Together with the folks you see on the bottom of the screen, they recruited people in the summer of 1950 to be plaintiffs. So all across our city, they knocked on doors, went to churches, made speeches, and ended up with 13 families that said, yes, we will be the plaintiffs in this case that you are putting together. This was an NAACP, very long campaign in Brown v. Board. Started with higher education cases and then went to the K-12 system. But these are the people who were plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of Education. And what you may notice, ladies, is that the majority of the plaintiffs in Brown were women. Just like if you look at the roles in the civil rights movement, women were out there in force, marching, keeping people motivated and encouraged. So Brown v. Board of Topeka were 13 plaintiffs, 12 women and 1 man, my father, Oliver Brown. The internet will tell you that Dad was the lead plaintiff because alphabetically he was first, and that's not true. Darlene Brown, for whom we didn't have a photo, would have been alphabetically first. My father was the 10th person to sign on. So we have to believe that a little bit of gender politics, a little sexism maybe, of the day, because you know men used to be all that, don't you? So for whatever reason, he was elevated to head the roster, not because he sued anyone. He was one of the these were collective actions. That's something we have to always remember, that these things, the greatest changes in this country came from collective action. But all of these women and my dad who reluctantly participated, because as he told Mom, I don't want to get involved with all those women. She was very persuasive, and he ended up, as fate would have it, with being known. These were the black schools in Topeka, so it wasn't about facilities, it was simply about segregation per se. The Davis case is my favorite because it was brought by teenagers. If you look at that screen, you see yourselves. In this country, the civil rights movement was a youth movement. Dr. King was only 24 when he got to Montgomery, 5 years out of his teens. When you look at this picture here, the case in Virginia was brought by these teenagers. 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Some of them 19, because back in the day, black parents would not let their children start school until they were physically able to make the walk, in some cases 5, 6, 7 miles one way. But they'd had enough on their own in that little old town of Farmville, Virginia. Went on strike, wrote to the NAACP and organized the case themselves because their parents had too much to lose. You know, their loans for grain because it was an agrarian community. But they said, enough already, we may be young, we are not stupid, we see what's happening. They went on strike. Dave Davis versus Prince Edward County. But the thing about Brown, the challenges, I think, are what really brings us here today. The challenges have been how this country has responded to Brown v. Board of Education. I remember when I went off to college in the summer of 1960, I got a letter from my college saying that I'd been assigned a roommate. This is how the challenges have been subtle and how we live with them even today. And my roommate's name was Kathy. She was from a little town in Missouri. I thought, fine, whatever. Went off, enjoyed my summer. August rolled around, I got another letter. I'd been assigned a different roommate. Her name was Rosalind. Rosalind was from New Jersey, and lo and behold, when I got there, Rosalind was black. I just assumed Kathy wasn't going to school there. Later in the semester, I met Kathy, and she was white, and she told me an interesting story. She said that summer she got a letter, too, telling her she had a roommate by the name of Cheryl Brown. But her letter had another paragraph in it that mine didn't. It told her parents that Cheryl was a Negro and asked whether or not they wanted their daughter rooming with a Negro, and they opted out. So activism, cutting my teeth on the civil rights movement as all of us did during that time, I got dressed all alone, went down to the dean of students and told the dean what I'd heard. Now the dean was an older white woman. This was a campus of about 1,000, small liberal arts, only 14 black students. So I told the dean what I heard. She got very red-faced and got ready to respond to me, and I held up my hand and I said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. The only mistake you made was not making certain the letter that came to my home didn't tell us that Kathy was white and didn't ask whether or not my mom wanted me rooming with a white girl. And if you're gonna be stupid, be equally stupid. So with all deliberate speed, which we know meant slow, the Southern Manifesto, which said Congress was going to try to roll back Brown, Governor Faubus closing schools in Little Rock, public schools in Virginia and Prince Edward County actually closed for 5 years. 5 years. No school for anybody unless you could get your child into some of the private academies. So if you're 8 years old in 3rd grade, 5 years later you're 13, you don't go back to school because you're not going back to 3rd grade at 13. But that's how committed this country has been to this whole issue of white supremacy and privilege for some. Ruby Bridges, a whole school year alone in her classroom, Boston, busing, and how that was finally unanticipated consequences. Nobody knew that this whole idea of us and them was so entrenched. These were all unanticipated consequences of Brown v. Board, and it's what we live with today. It is sadly the greater legacy of Brown, and that is white flight, which is something that I'm sure that all the attorneys in Brown had never heard of, redrawing school attendance boundaries, school closings, the way we finance schools, so if you live in an impoverished community, you won't have the resources to make sure it's a level playing field. The majority of public schools remaining segregated, magnet schools, reduced diversity among our educators. Now, then we look at the Bakke case, which gave us reverse discrimination, busing, which was fine as long as I was being bused away, not so fine in the other way, private schools withholding resources, and every now and then people suggesting scientifically there's just something wrong with black folks. Well, I'll tell you what. In closing, you see, my father was not an activist, but sometimes we're called on to do things that are right, even though it may be a risk, even though we may feel our lives are in danger. You see, my dad in that era was like most black men living in the margins, almost invisible. He wanted to be a leader. He was civic-minded. He married his high school sweetheart. First of all, he drove a coal truck to support the family. He worked as a bellman in a whites-only hotel. He even became a boxer. He kind of looked like Joe Louis, and Joe Louis was his idol, so he boxed in the Golden Glove. And the funny story in our family is that the first time Dad was knocked out, he was called into the ministry. And somehow laying down there on that mat, he probably figured, oh Lord. So he got up off that mat, left the boxing world behind, went to school to become a pastor and became Reverend Oliver L. Brown. He became that civic-minded leader that he knew he could always be, but he took the reins. You see, everything we do is a choice we make. Education is still the thing that makes the biggest difference. Everybody in this room that is a teacher, would you raise your hand or planning to be so? We need to give them a round of applause right now, because they do a job that is very hard. They do a job that many of you could not fathom. I used to be a teacher. It is hard work. And I have threatened, believe you me, that when they start paying LeBron James money, I'm coming back. But it is so necessary, you know. Do we respect our educators? Are we raising teachable children? You know, we need to flip the script on some of our values. Yes, it's fun to watch a b-ball game. Yes, it's great to watch a music video. But at the end of the day, they are not teaching algebra down at the ball field. At the end of the day, that music video goes off and they go home and they're spending their millions, and what are we left with? We have to be very smart about our individual lives, because everybody that's ever lived leaves a legacy. You need to decide what that legacy will be for you. Thank you.
I'm a little taller. Let's give her another round of applause. Wasn't that amazing? At this time, I want to ask Mrs. Brown Henderson to join me at the podium. I want to present you on behalf of the Albany State University Ram family and our interim president, Dr. Dunning, with a token of our appreciation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. At this time, we're going to have Dr. Clifford Porter come to the stage and give us some closing remarks.
There's an old spiritual that says, somebody prayed for me. They took the time and prayed for me. They had me on their mind. As I watched this film today, as I listened to Ms. Brown Henderson, I could only think that somebody prayed for us, that somebody marched for us, somebody filed lawsuits for us. We should be grateful today. We should be very grateful today. This celebration of Martin Luther King holiday is not just a celebration of Dr. King, but of men and women like the Reverend Oliver Brown, who wanted to make life better for their fellow man. Reverend Brown knew that if he wanted to make things better for his daughters, he would have to make it better for all children across this nation. So he stepped into a place of discomfort so that you and I would have the comfort of receiving the type of education that today is offered here at Albany State University. To me, Reverend Brown is a national hero. We should be grateful that he opened the doors of education to all of us. On behalf of our president, Dr. Dunning, I'd like to challenge our students to use your life to make society better for those who will follow the trail that you leave behind. Dr. King and Reverend Brown certainly left us better off. Now it's our turn. Let us set a new standard for civil and human rights. Let us be champions for freedom, justice, and equality. The legacy of your generation is being written today. Right now, you are defining what it means to be young, gifted, and black. Make your mark and maximize the freedoms that they fought so diligently for. Your excellence in the classroom, in the boardroom, and throughout society will ensure that their sacrifices will not be in vain. Mrs. Brown Henderson, I'd like to thank you on behalf of our president, our faculty, and staff for your inspirational words and being a part of Albany State history today. You have moved us and motivated us to be better, to continue the struggle. Let us celebrate this holiday as a day on for service and not just another day off. Happy Martin Luther King Day to each of you. I'd like to make a couple of announcements. We'd like to acknowledge, first of all, I think we have several of our elected officials here from the city of Albany that I saw come in. We'd like to acknowledge them. If you would please stand so that we can give you a round of applause. I think I saw school board members and county commissioners. I also would like to acknowledge the members of the clergy who are here with us today. We'd like for you all to stand and we acknowledge you as well. Thank you all. Our illustrious president is not here, but he cared enough to send his very best. Ms. Karen Baines Dunning, would you please stand, First Lady of Albany State University? Thank you. And last but not least, the students of Albany State University, you all please stand, the new history makers. Thank you. I have two quick announcements and then I will take my seat. The first being, if you're interested in the court-appointed special advocates program for children, we will be having a meeting, an information session right after this program in the student unit ballroom. Immediately after the program, and refreshments will be served. Secondly, we'd like to acknowledge Mr. Frank Wilson from the Albany Civil Rights Institute. And if you're interested, and I hope that you are, please join us today at 1:30 p.m. for a tour at the Albany Civil Rights Institute, which is at 326 Whitney Avenue here in Albany. ASU students, if you have your ID, it's free. General admission is $6, and our senior citizen admission is $5. Mr. Wilson, I don't think you stood up, did you? They need to know who you are when they come for the tour. Please, let's acknowledge Mr. Wilson. And Dr. Shelton, Ms. Williams, thank you all so much for bringing us such a powerful speaker. You did a wonderful job. Thank you all very much.
Thank you again, Mr. Porter. That was awesome. Now we're going to formally close with the alma mater. For those of you who are a little iffy on it, it's on the back of your program.
Will you please stand?
Albany State, we dearly love you, whose walls are inscribed with knowledge so true, so solidly built on this foundation, a union of work and inspiration. Teachers for those who strive for success, to thee we give praises above all the rest. Thy jubilant colors of blue and gold will ever honor and ever behold. Thy name is an anchor upon thy sea, and sailing we put our trust in thee. In thee as true we see all